The city glittered beyond the hospital glass, a scatter of winter lights strung along avenues and rooftops, while inside, the corridor sat in a hush that smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Emma Carter folded herself into the narrow bench by the billing office window, coat pulled tight at the collar. The heater ticked, the vending machine hummed, and somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in a steady, stubborn rhythm. She watched her breath cloud the glass for a moment, then fade. Across her lap lay a thin envelope, soft at the edges from too many nights in her pocket. She had written one word on the front in a careful hand, Mom. Inside were quarters and nickels and a few wrinkled singles, tips from the rooms she cleaned, change left on tray tables, coins rescued from the bottoms of washers. The envelope had weight only because of the coins. Otherwise, it could have floated away like a wish. Stabilized Carter coughed behind the door marked Room 412. The sound was raw, tugging from somewhere deep. Emma had learned to listen without flinching, to answer with a smile when she stepped in to adjust blankets or lift a straw to parched lips. "It's all right, Mom," she would say, quiet and steady. "We're almost there." She said it the way a person keeps a candle lit in wind. Her shift had started before dawn and stretched past dark. Windows wiped, floors mopped, linen carts steered down long hallways where people pretended not to see the girl in scrubs. She did not mind the work. Hard work had a shape she could hold. What frightened her were the numbers on the estimate the billing clerk had printed, a tower of digits that looked like another language. Pepped from the envelope and pinged against the tile. Emma startled, then bent to retrieve it, turning the coin between her fingers as if warmth might rise from metal. She pressed it back into the packet and smoothed the flap the way she once smoothed her mother's hair. "Not tonight," she told the coin, and meant it for fear. When the light above the counter turned from red to green, Emma stood. The clerk, a woman about her mother's age with tidy glasses and tired eyes, took the envelope and poured the coins into a plastic tray. Counting amplified in the room. Click, slide, click. Emma watched the tally appear on the screen. She had rehearsed what to say the whole walk from room 412, that she would bring more soon, that she had extra hours on the schedule next week, that she would not fall behind. The clerk finished and cleared her throat. "I'm sorry," she said, voice professional but not unkind. "It isn't enough to post to the account." "Peacefully am I?" Emma asked, though she already knew. The clerk named a number that made Emma feel both light and heavy at once, as if gravity had failed only under her ribs. "We can place a hold and check again in a few days," the woman added, almost gently, "but we can't admit tonight without the minimum." On the edge of the counter, she imagined the laundry room at work, the spin of industrial washers, the quarters lined up like little moons on the folding table. She imagined the neat rows of rooms upstairs where she changed sheets with quiet hands. "She's short of breath," Emma said softly. "She needs oxygen at night. The doctor—" "Ragazing," the clerk said, and Emma believed she did. Understanding, however, did not change policy. The woman pushed the envelope back across the counter, now lighter by the weight of a hope counted and returned. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "Not enough." The words landed with a thud that echoed. Emma nodded as if the news were an expected guest. She took the envelope, murmured thank you, and moved to the row of chairs by the window. The city looked close enough to touch. Every light a room where someone was cooking dinner, switching channels, laughing at a small story that had gone right. In here, the fluorescent bulbs hummed, and the floor shone in a way that made her think of ice. Her muscles remembered the day, the cart's weight, the sting in her wrists, the chlorine smell that followed her home and collected in her clothes. She sat. The bench creaked. She folded over the envelope and pressed it to her chest. Breath came uneven, a stubborn, juddering thing she tried to tame. She thought of Grace's hand in hers, the way her mother always rubbed small circles on her thumb, as if polishing away every bad chance. "We're almost there," she had said. She was not sure where there was anymore, only that it must be some place with a door that would open for them. A nurse pushed a cart past, wheels whispering over the waxed floor. Two residents spoke in low voices, the syllables of medicine clipping along like train cars. No one stopped. Emma preferred it that way. Pity made her skin prickle. Advice slid off like water. Work and quiet and small steps forward. Those were the tools she trusted. Still, the sentence the clerk had spoken kept ringing, 3 flat notes she couldn't mute. Not enough, not enough, not enough. Palos her knees and squared its corners with slow care. 1 coin had been caught in the fold. She freed it, then pressed her palm over the hole, an instinct, like shielding a flame. On the other side of the window, a siren traced a bright sound through the street and faded. Emma swallowed and let herself lean back until her shoulders touched the painted cinder block wall. A breath in, a breath out. 1 more. Forgiveness approached, brisk at first, then slower, as if the walker had miscounted his errands and found himself with a question. The steps paused at the edge of the billing office light. Emma did not look up. She fixed her eyes on the faint reflection of her face in the glass. A young woman with a stubborn jaw and a winter's worth of worry gathered between her brows, and held her envelope like a promise she refused to break. The footsteps remained. A shadow lengthened across the floor. Someone had stopped, not to offer advice or pass judgment, but because the soft sound a person makes when hope slips had reached him where the city lights could not. The polished click of leather shoes slowed, then stopped altogether, interrupted by the thin sound of a young woman trying not to cry. Alexander Hayes stood just beyond the halo of fluorescent light spilling from the billing office. He had walked this same corridor countless times before, most often in tailored suits, following trustees or speaking with directors. Tonight, however, he was alone. His tie loosened from a long evening in the boardroom where donors and executives congratulated one another on pledges written on fine stationery. The air there had smelled of champagne and ink. Out here, it smelled of disinfectant and weary hope. He adjusted the cuff of his coat, intending to continue toward the exit, but the sound rooted him. Not the loud wail of grief or anger. He had grown accustomed to those over years of making decisions that cost people jobs. But a fragile catch in the throat, the muffled sob of someone too exhausted to protest anymore. He turned his head and saw her, a young woman curled over an envelope on her knees, hair fallen loose around her face, shoulders drawn in as if to make herself smaller than the cold bench could already make her. Alexander had spent years cultivating distance. He believed feelings muddied vision, and vision was what had allowed him to pull his company from near ruin to national prominence. His discipline was legendary. He cut what had to be cut, closed what had to be closed, and never once apologized. He told himself this moment was no different. He should keep walking. Yet his hand refused to move from his side, and his eyes lingered, narrowing as though studying a riddle. From where he stood, he could see the clerk sliding coins back across the counter. "I'm sorry," the woman in glasses said, voice flat from repetition. "Not enough." The phrase struck him. He had heard it in business negotiations, in board reports, but here it was aimed at a girl who looked hardly older than some of his interns, her hands trembling as she accepted the envelope again. Emma lowered herself onto the bench. The clerk looked up when his shadow stretched across the counter. Her eyes widened slightly, recognizing the name on the badge clipped to his coat pocket. "Mr. Hayes?" she asked, half whisper, half disbelief. He inclined his head. His presence was enough to still the air. "Show me the account," he said, voice measured. The clerk blinked, then turned to her screen, fingers trembling slightly on the keyboard. Numbers filled the display, columns of charges, red warnings flashing beside dates. Alexander reached into the inner pocket of his coat, withdrew a checkbook embossed with his initials, and placed it on the counter. The pen scratched in steady strokes. Emma, startled by the sound, lifted her head. Her eyes were glassy, rimmed red, but still fierce in a way that caught him off guard. She watched as the stranger in a dark coat signed his name with an ease that made the impossible seem routine. A piece of paper slid across the counter. The clerk stared at it, then back at him. "Niece will cover the admission," Alexander said simply. Confirm the surgery. The clerk swallowed, nodding quickly. Yes, sir, right away. She gathered the forms, her hands moving with new urgency. Emma's lips parted, but no words came. She stared at the signature, Alexander Hayes, without recognition of what it meant in the world outside these hospital walls. To her, it was only ink, yet ink that carried the weight of a miracle. The man did not look at her directly. His eyes, sharp as glass, seemed fixed on something past her, though she could feel the current of his attention like heat. Cold in color, but heavy in depth, his gaze was the kind that left people unsettled, unsure whether they had been judged or understood. For a moment, Emma wanted to ask why he had stopped, why he had cared, but her throat closed and the words tangled behind her ribs. By the time she drew breath, by the time she lifted her chin to speak, the counter was empty. The checkbook was gone. The figure in the dark coat already retreating down the corridor. Only the fading rhythm of his leather shoes remained, echoing like a secret carried into the night. Emma clutched the envelope tighter, coins clinking inside, suddenly meaningless. She blinked hard, trying to reconcile what had just happened. A stranger had reached into the storm of her despair, and with a single stroke of a pen shifted its course. Yet he had left without name, without explanation, leaving her with nothing but questions and the image of eyes that looked through her as if they had seen something worth stopping for. Somewhere beyond the glass doors, the city lights pulsed. Emma sat still, caught between disbelief and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she had not been as alone as she thought. The steady beeping of the heart monitor carried through the recovery room, each sound a reassurance that life still pulsed in the body lying beneath the white sheets. Morning light filtered in through narrow blinds, thin bars of gold striping the floor. Emma sat close to the bed, her chair drawn so near her knees nearly touched the rail. On the small table beside her mother's hand, she had placed a single coin, a quarter smoothed by years of circulation. Like a talisman, a reminder of the envelope she had clutched through sleepless nights. Grace Carter stirred, lids fluttering before opening slowly. Her face was pale, lips dry, but color had returned to her cheeks in a fragile glow. Emma straightened, fingers trembling as she brushed hair away from her mother's forehead. "Mom," she whispered, voice cracking. "You made it." The Berg door creaked open, and Dr. Whitman entered, coat crisp, expression tired but softened by something rare. Relief. He carried a chart but set it aside quickly. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," he said, voice even. "The repair held, her vitals are stable. She'll need rest and follow-up care, but she's through the hardest part." Emma covered her face for a moment, stifling a sob. She had rehearsed strength for weeks, telling herself she could not collapse, not in front of nurses, not where her mother could see. Now, with the doctor's words settling into her bones, she allowed herself to weep. She leaned down, forehead resting on Grace's hand, shoulders trembling. Grace's fingers moved weakly, stroking her daughter's hair, the way she had when Emma was a child fighting fever. Her voice was no more than a breath. Who did this for us?" Emma lifted her head, eyes glistening. She wanted to say a name, to give her mother the comfort of knowing someone was watching over them. But all she could do was shake her head. "I don't know, Mom. I really don't." The words caught in her throat. "All I know is that we're here, together, and that's enough for me." Led faintly, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening with affection. "You're enough," she murmured, before sleep tugged her back into quiet. Emma sat a while longer, letting the rhythm of the monitor steady her heartbeat. She picked up the coin from the table, held it in her palm, then set it back with care. "We'll keep our promise," she whispered, "every step forward, no matter how small." A knock the stillness. A nurse wheeled in a cart with breakfast trays and, balanced at the top, a basket of flowers, lilies and pale roses arranged with an elegance that felt out of place in the sterile room. A small card leaned against the vase. No message, no signature. Only the fragrance of blooms, fresh and cool, filling the air. Emma stared at the basket, heart quickening. She reached out, turning the card over as if the name might be hidden on the back. Blank. She glanced at her sleeping mother, then back at the flowers. Someone had remembered them. Someone who had chosen to remain unseen. She pressed her lips together, unease mingling with gratitude. In a world where kindness often came with a price, what did it mean when generosity wore no name? The monitor beeped on, steady as ever, but Emma could not shake the question that now lay across her chest like another weight. Who had saved them, and why remain hidden? The flowers gave no answer, only their fragrance lingering in the morning light. The apartment was quiet except for the creak of a wooden chair that had outlived its polish. Its legs wobbled slightly whenever Emma leaned against it, the sound sharp against the hush of a spring afternoon. The place was small, 2 rooms, narrow windows, walls that had once been white but now carried the faint stains of years gone by. Yet within those limits, Emma moved with care, trying to carve comfort out of scarcity. Grace sat propped up on the old sofa, a blanket tucked around her knees. The surgery had left her weak, her breaths still shallow at times, but color had returned to her cheeks. Emma set a steaming bowl of soup on the table, a broth stretched thin with a few carrots floating like small bursts of color. She pulled the chair closer and sat, balancing her notebook beside the bowl. The pages were covered with rows of numbers, written and rewritten in pencil, smudges where she had erased and tried again. Rent, utilities, medication, hours at work, nothing quite balanced. "Don't frown so hard," Grace murmured, her voice soft but teasing. "You'll leave lines on that pretty forehead." Emma closed the notebook, forcing a smile. "I'm just making sure everything adds up." She pushed the soup closer to her mother. "Eat while it's warm." Grace lifted the spoon with shaky hands, taking a careful sip. The chair creaked again as Emma leaned forward, watching. It wasn't much of a meal, but it was what they had. The scent of broth mingled with the faint mustiness of old fabric and the distant sound of children playing in the courtyard below. For a moment, Emma let herself imagine a life where meals came without arithmetic, where her mother's laughter wasn't clipped by fatigue. She reached for the quarter on the table, the same one she had carried into the hospital that night, now polished smooth from her fingers. She placed it beside her mother's bowl like an unspoken vow. "I'll repay it, Mom," she whispered. "Somehow I'll make it right. I'll return what was given to us." Grace's eyes softened. She set the spoon down and reached across the table to touch her daughter's hand. "The only debt I care about is having you by my side." Emma's throat tightened. She looked down, unwilling to let her mother see the tears gathering. The chair groaned under her as she shifted, the old wood echoing their years of struggle. After a pause, Grace spoke again, quieter this time. "That man, the one who helped us, has he come back?" Emma's lips parted, but no words emerged. She stared at the scratched surface of the table, where years of meals had left faint circles, and shook her head. Silence hung between them, heavy and unfinished. The hallway, the sudden chime of the doorbell rang through the apartment. Both women turned toward the sound. Emma's heart jumped into her throat. Through the frosted glass of the door, a shadow shifted, tall and unmistakable, waiting just beyond the threshold. The door opened with a reluctant creak, hinges straining as if they too had grown used to being left alone. Emma squinted into the glow of the hallway light. A tall figure stood framed against the faded green walls of the building, the hum of the fluorescent bulb above him flickering in uneven rhythm. In his hands was a bouquet of lilies and pale roses, arranged so carefully it seemed out of place in the shabby corridor. Her breath caught. The flowers were nearly identical to the basket that had appeared at the hospital with no name attached. Now, in the hand of this stranger, the unspoken question from that morning seemed to have found its answer. "Miss Carter?" the man asked, his voice deep but gentle. His eyes, gray and steady, searched hers with a quiet sincerity. "I hope I'm not intruding." Tightened her grip on the doorframe. "You're from the hospital." She remembered the sound of his shoes on the tile, the check that had slid across the counter, the way he had disappeared before she could speak. He nodded once. "Alexander Hayes." He extended the flowers slightly, not pushing them into her arms, just offering. "I came to see how your mother is recovering." Emma hesitated, torn between suspicion and gratitude. Before she could speak, Grace's voice drifted weakly from the sofa inside. "Emma, who is it?" Emma glanced back, then stepped aside. "It's someone from the hospital, Mom." She motioned carefully, allowing him into the small apartment. The contrast was striking. Alexander stepped from the cold hallway into a room softened by years of use. The scent of broth still lingered in the air, and the wooden chair by the table looked as though it might collapse under the weight of another story. Grace sat with a blanket tucked around her shoulders, her face pale, but her smile warm as she looked up at the visitor. "These are for you," Alexander said, placing the bouquet gently on the table near her. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect more than formality. "I heard about your surgery. I'm glad to see you sitting up." Grace's eyes glistened. She reached out as if to touch the flowers, then stopped, her hand trembling. You were the one?" Glazed offered a modest smile. "I only did what was needed." Imance crossed her arms, her cheeks warm. Gratitude swelled in her chest, yet unease curled around it. The room was too small for such a presence, too humble for a man who carried himself like marble, carved smooth by years of discipline. She blurted before she could stop herself. "Why? Why would you do this for us?" Alexander looked at her then, fully, his gaze steady but not piercing. "Because no one should fight alone." His words landed with a weight that silenced the ticking clock on the wall. Words that seemed less like charity and more like conviction. Grace's smile broadened, soft with relief. "God bless you," she whispered. But Emma's eyes, though damp with unspoken gratitude, held questions that no bouquet could answer. She lowered her gaze, unsure if kindness that large could ever come without cost. The lilies filled the room with fragrance, but to her, the air carried both comfort and suspicion. And as Grace settled back into her chair, smiling at their guest, Emma stood silently at the edge, her heart torn between hope and doubt. Near the hallway smelled faintly of bleach and damp mops, the sort of scent that clung to Emma's clothes long after her shift ended. She pushed the cart steadily, her shoulders sore, eyes heavy with the weight of another late night. Around her, the building was quieter than usual, patients already asleep, monitors humming in muffled rooms. Yet behind her, in the shadow of the laundry chute, whispers rose like smoke. At first, she tried to ignore them, the way she had ignored countless comments before. But tonight, the voices weren't muffled enough to be missed. "Did you see him at her door?" one voice said, sharp with curiosity. "Bouquet of lilies, can you imagine?" Another chimed in, half laughing. "Not the kind you pick up from the corner store, either." And tightened on the cart handle. Her pace slowed, though she told herself not to listen. Gossip had always found her, about her hours, her quietness, her lack of family. But this had a new flavor, sharper, sweetened with envy. Nick's deliberate cough sounded. Marcia, her fellow housekeeper, emerged from the supply closet, a stack of folded sheets in her arms. She leaned against the doorframe, eyes trailing Emma with a smile that didn't reach them. "Funny how life works, isn't it?" she said casually, too loudly for casual. "Some people scrub floors for years and never catch a break. And some," her glance flicked to the flowers Emma had tucked in her locker earlier, "some just happen to have the right visitor." Emma froze, back stiff. "It wasn't like that," she managed, but her voice was thin, almost drowned by the squeak of the mop bucket wheels. Marcia's smirk sharpened. "No one gives away something for nothing, honey. Men like that, they don't notice girls like us without expecting something." She tilted her head, letting the suggestion hang in the air like dust. The words burned hotter than bleach fumes. Emma wanted to protest, to tell her that Alexander had said nothing improper, that his eyes held no calculation. But in the sterile corridor, with Marcia's knowing look and the silence of others who chose not to step in, she found no defense that would be believed. Her throat closed. So she did what she always did. She lowered her gaze, bent to her work, and wheeled the cart forward. The brush of her mop against the floor was steady, a rhythm she could cling to. Yet behind her, the whispers multiplied, each step echoing with a rumor she could not control. Her cheeks flushed, her chest tightened. The scent of disinfectant stung her nose, and she blinked quickly, willing her tears to stay hidden. If she stopped to explain, no one would listen. If she kept moving, at least the floor would shine. Flooring for a moment, she remembered her mother's smile earlier that day, faint but bright enough to fill their tiny apartment. That was the truth that mattered. Not these voices. Not the envy that turned kindness into suspicion. The elevator bell chimed, and from down the hall, Nurse Kelly appeared, clipboard in hand. Her step was brisk, her eyes scanning until they landed on Emma. "Carter," she called, her tone clipped but not unkind. "You're wanted upstairs. Office wants a word." Emma paused mid-swipe, mop dripping onto the tile. She looked up startled. Around her, the whispers fell into sudden silence. Marcia raised an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth curling in satisfaction. Emma set the mop aside, heart pounding. She wiped her hands on her apron, then followed Kelly toward the stairwell. The cart, the bucket, the faint smell of bleach, she left them behind, but the weight of rumor clung stubbornly, as if it too was determined to follow her into the unknown of the office upstairs. A thick folder lay open on the administrator's desk, its pages covered with clipped receipts and medical notes. One line had been circled in red ink, the mark loud against the sterile beige of the office walls. Emma stood on the far side of the desk, fingers twisted together, while the fluorescent light above hummed steadily, indifferent to the weight in the room. Nurse Kelly sat in the corner, arms folded, her expression troubled. She had always been brisk but fair with Emma, yet now her eyes avoided direct contact. In the leather chair behind the desk reclined Mr. Clifford, a trustee of the hospital's charity fund. His suit was dark, his tie a little too tight, and his voice smooth with the confidence of a man accustomed to being heard. "You see," he began, tapping the red circle with his pen, "the sudden payment on this account raises questions. A bill of this size doesn't vanish overnight without, intervention." His gaze moved to Emma, sharp as glass. "And we are to believe that a maid, with no family support and no savings, suddenly managed it?" Defiance quickened. She wanted to speak, but Clifford pressed on, savoring the sound of his own suspicion. "There are whispers," he continued, "whispers that Mr. Hayes has taken a special interest in you, that he's invested personally. Now the foundation cannot, must not, be misused to indulge private affairs." He leaned back, spreading his hands. "So tell us, Miss Carter, what exactly have you done to secure this generosity?" Emma's cheeks flushed hot. "I didn't do anything," she said quickly, voice trembling. "I never asked him. I never even knew his name until after." She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I only wanted my mother to live." Emma shifted, her brows knitting. "Emma," she said gently but firmly, "you must understand how it looks. Payments like this aren't ordinary." "How it looks," Emma whispered, fighting to steady her voice. "But I promise you, I never tried to deceive anyone. He did it on his own. I can't explain why." She looked down at her hands, pale against her uniform.
"All I've ever done is work, every night, every shift. I just wanted my mother to have a chance."
But Clifford chuckled, the sound low and dismissive.
"Touching,"
he said.
"Very touching. But we've seen this before. Someone with little means suddenly finding favor with a wealthy man. It rarely ends well, for the hospital or the reputation of those involved."
He closed the folder with a snap, as though the case were already settled. Emma's chest tightened, her eyes blurred. The words she had rehearsed in silence, the defenses she had built in her head, scattered like dust under his stare.
"I just wanted my mother to live,"
she repeated, her voice breaking now, raw with desperation. The room was still for a moment, her words hanging like fragile glass. Clifford's smirk deepened, certain of his victory. Kelly pressed her lips together, clearly torn but silent. Emma stood alone, her hope balanced on the edge of collapse. Then the door burst open. The handle struck the wall with a sharp crack, and in the doorway stood Alexander Hayes. He filled the frame, shoulders squared, coat dark against the sterile light. His eyes, cool steel, swept the room and landed on Emma. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, while the silence shifted, heavy now with the presence of someone who could not be ignored. Enough. The single word cut through the room like a blade, steady and sharp. Alexander Hayes stepped inside fully, the door clicking shut behind him, and for a heartbeat the air seemed to thin. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority beneath it. Even the fluorescent light above appeared to hesitate in its flicker, as though reluctant to intrude. Clifford shifted in his chair, the smug tilt of his mouth faltering. "Mr. Hayes," he said, half rising, as if caught unprepared. "We were just—" "You were accusing her," Alexander interrupted, his gaze steady as iron. He moved closer, every step deliberate, the heels of his polished shoes ringing against the linoleum. He stopped by Emma's side, close enough that she could feel the quiet certainty radiating from him. His presence filled the office, leaving no room for doubt or whispered rumor. "She never asked me for a single thing," he continued, his eyes locking on Clifford. "Not money, not favors, not attention. If there is any confusion here, let me clear it now. The decision to pay her mother's bill was mine, and mine alone." Kelly cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Hayes, we only meant secure it to question her integrity," Alexander said, his voice low but commanding. "And I won't allow it. Emma Carter has worked harder than anyone in this hospital gives her credit for. She has done nothing but give, and the one time life gives back, you call it manipulation?" He leaned forward, bracing his hand on the desk. "I will not see her dignity shredded to satisfy your suspicion." And the room fell silent. Kelly lowered her eyes, shame flickering across her face. Clifford, however, forced a thin smile, though his knuckles whitened where they gripped the arm of his chair. "With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, the hospital has a responsibility—" "No, the hospital," Alexander cut in, "runs in part on the funding of people like me. And let me be very clear, if this slander against her continues, my support will vanish. Every cent." His words were not shouted, but they landed with the weight of stone. Decide which is more valuable, a baseless rumor or the stability of this institution. Clifford's face flushed, the fight draining from his posture. He leaned back in his chair, lips pressed tight, silent at last. Emma stood frozen, her breath shallow. She had never seen anyone speak for her with such force, never imagined a man of his stature would stake his reputation against a storm of gossip just to protect her. Gratitude swelled in her chest, tangled with disbelief. Alexander straightened, his expression softening as his eyes shifted briefly toward Emma. His voice gentled, almost private despite the room full of witnesses. "No one should fight alone," he said, echoing words he had spoken before. Words that sank deeper now, heavy with meaning. Kelly scribbled something quickly on her clipboard, avoiding eye contact, while Clifford remained stiff and silent. The office that had felt so hostile minutes earlier now seemed subdued. The balance of power decisively shifted. Emma's gaze lingered on Alexander, her mind spinning. Did he defend her because it was right, or because of something else entirely? As his words echoed in her chest, she could not stop the question forming like a whisper she didn't dare voice. Was this only kindness? Or was it something more? On the reception desk of the hospital, a sealed envelope lay waiting, its cream paper stark against the dull counter. Emma was called over by Nurse Kelly, who slid it toward her with a look of quiet wonder. Inside was a check, large enough to cover not only the surgery, but every remaining balance on Grace's account. The numbers blurred as Emma stared, her heart racing. Grace, frail but smiling beside her, pressed Emma's hand. "We're free of the debt, darling," she whispered, tears rising. Gratitude trembled in her voice, but Emma's chest tightened instead of easing. She found Alexander later, standing near a window where the light cut across his face. Her steps were unsteady, her fists clenched around the envelope. "Why did you do this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. I never asked. I don't want to be anyone's burden." Alexander regarded her quietly, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, then finally replied, low and steady, "One day, you'll understand." The words lingered, leaving Emma suspended between fierce pride and aching gratitude, unsure which would win. The afternoon sun slanted across the narrow courtyard, warming the peeling paint of the apartment block. Alexander stood on a small ladder outside Emma's door, sleeves rolled back as he hammered a loose piece of tin back into place on the awning. The sharp clang echoed down the row of units, drawing the curious eyes of neighbors. From the steps below, a little girl with braids tilted her head. "Is he your boyfriend?" she asked innocently, her wide eyes fixed on Emma. Emma flushed, nearly dropping the laundry she was carrying. "No, sweetie, he's just helping us," she murmured, glancing nervously toward her mother, who was watching from inside with a quiet smile. Grace's amusement was unmistakable, her thin shoulders shaking with a soft laugh. Alexander climbed down, dusting his hands. He didn't answer the child, but his gaze lingered on Emma as she guided her mother back into the shade, adjusting pillows and tucking the blanket around her shoulders. His expression softened as if he had discovered something he hadn't expected, an affection deeper than words. When he finally turned to leave, Emma found herself watching his back, her pulse quickening. For one fragile moment, her heart leaned toward him, only for her pride to pull her eyes away. She turned sharply, pretending to busy herself, though the echo of the child's question lingered in her chest. The hallway stretched endlessly, washed in the sterile glow of white lights. Emma sat hunched on a plastic chair, her hands twisting in her lap, the faint echo of monitors and muffled footsteps pressing in from all sides. Behind the heavy doors, her mother was in surgery, and every tick of the clock felt like a stone dropped into her chest. Alexander appeared quietly, carrying a small paper bag. He set it down beside her and pulled out a cup of steaming soup. Without a word, he placed it in her hands, his steady presence more comforting than any speech. For a moment, Emma stared at the rising steam. Then her composure cracked. "If something happens to her," her voice broke, raw and trembling, "I won't survive it. I can't." He leaned closer, his hand covering hers, firm and warm. His voice was calm, unshaken. "Then don't carry it alone. Let me wait with you." Emma's tears fell freely now, but she didn't pull away. The silence between them shifted, no longer empty, but filled with the fragile courage of two people holding each other against the storm. Then, suddenly, the surgical doors swung open, and a doctor stepped into the hallway, mask lowered, eyes solemn. Emma froze, her breath locked in her chest as the moment of truth approached. The surgery was a success. Dr. Whitman's words filled the recovery room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. His tired smile carried reassurance, the kind that loosened every knot in Emma's chest. For a heartbeat, she could not move. Then her body surged forward. She clutched her mother's hand, pressing her forehead against it. Sobs spilling freely, this time from joy. Grace stirred, eyelids fluttering open, her face pale but soft. "Emma." Her voice was faint, yet steady enough to make Emma's tears fall harder. She bent close, kissing her mother's hand again and again, whispering thank yous that tangled with her cries. Behind them, Alexander stood quietly near the foot of the bed. His broad shoulders, so often squared with authority, seemed to sag as if a burden had been lifted from him too. His eyes shone, red-rimmed though he tried to blink it away. For once, he didn't mask it with composure. Dr. Whitman adjusted the chart, nodding once more before slipping out, leaving the three of them in a cocoon of hushed relief. Emma finally looked up, her gaze catching Alexander's. The gratitude in her chest was so fierce it almost hurt. Grace, still half dreaming, let her eyes drift between them. Her lips curved in a faint smile. "Con-a," she murmured. "This man, is he our miracle?" Emma froze. The question hung in the air, fragile and heavy all at once. She looked at her mother, then at Alexander. His expression was unreadable, yet his eyes brimmed with something she had not dared to name, something tender, unguarded. Her heart swelled with emotions she could not sort: gratitude, confusion, fear, and a pull she could no longer ignore. She squeezed her mother's hand, then lowered her gaze, unable to answer, while the weight of Grace's question echoed in her chest. For the first time, Emma felt that her life had shifted onto a path she had not chosen, one lit by kindness but tangled with feelings far deeper than she was ready to admit. The steady rhythm of Grace's heartbeat pulsed across the monitor, each beep a reminder that her life had been given back. The harsh shadows of fear had softened. In their place lingered a fragile peace. A few days had passed since the operation, and though her body remained weak, her spirit seemed brighter with every visit. Alexander came often, sometimes with fresh fruit in a paper bag, sometimes with books tucked under his arm. He never arrived with grandeur or noise, only a quiet presence that filled the small room with steadiness. Grace, reclined against her pillows, welcomed him each time as if he were family. That afternoon, the sun slanted through the blinds, painting stripes across the bedspread. Alexander sat in the chair by Grace's side, listening as she spoke of her youth, stories of dances held in town halls, of her late husband's laughter, of struggles endured and endured again. He listened intently, nodding, asking small questions that showed he cared. Every so often, Grace chuckled, and the sound, thin but genuine, seemed to light up the room. Emma, standing by the windowsill, watched in silence. She held a basket of fruit Alexander had brought, her fingers tightening around the handle as she took in the scene, her mother smiling, her guest leaning forward with warmth in his eyes. It was a simple moment, yet it unsettled her more than any accusation or hardship. Something in her chest stirred: warmth, gratitude, and a nervous flutter she could not quite name. Eyes met Alexander's briefly when he glanced her way, and she looked down quickly, cheeks warm. She busied herself arranging apples on the tray, though her hands trembled. As the evening grew dim, Grace reached for her daughter's hand. Her palm was thin but strong, the grip filled with the quiet wisdom of years. "Don't be afraid of love, Emma," she whispered, her eyes soft but insistent. "If someone has earned a place in your heart, let them in. Don't shut the door before it's even opened." Emma's breath caught. She pressed her mother's hand tighter, the words sinking into her chest like seeds waiting to grow. But she couldn't answer. Not yet. Alexander rose to leave, offering a polite smile. But Emma stood still, her heart heavy with her mother's counsel. The monitor beeped steadily in the background, as if to echo Grace's words, steady, alive, and urging Emma to listen. The park was quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of quiet that seemed to invite memories. Leaves, golden and brittle, drifted down in slow spirals, gathering around the edges of the old wooden benches. Emma sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the patterns of sunlight play across the pond. The city's noise seemed far away here, softened into nothing more than a distant hum. Beside her, carrying the air of a man unaccustomed to leisure, yet willing to learn. He had invited her for a walk, and though she hesitated at first, she found herself drawn to the calm of this place, to the possibility of speaking without walls between them. They strolled slowly, their steps matching without thought. Alexander asked about her childhood, and she told him of summers spent helping her mother in the garden, of evenings when the electricity went out and they lit candles and shared stories. He listened carefully, as if each detail was precious. In return, he spoke of his own youth, lonely dinners in vast dining rooms, the silence of corridors too long for laughter to fill. Emma looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time she saw not the billionaire or benefactor, but a man who had carried his own emptiness. "So, even with everything, you were alone," she said softly. He nodded. "Loneliness doesn't ask how much money you have." They sat down on a bench where the wind shook loose another cascade of leaves. For a while they were silent, watching a child chase a red ball across the grass. Emma's heart beat unsteadily. torn between gratitude and fear, between wanting to lean closer and wanting to run from what that meant. Then Alexander spoke, his voice lower, almost a whisper meant only for her. "You don't need to lean on me because you're poor, Emma. That's not why I'm here." He turned toward her, his eyes catching the fading light. "I need you because you're the light I've been searching for." Her breath caught. The world seemed to still. The rustle of leaves, the laughter in the distance, all falling away until only his words remained. Emma's hands trembled in her lap. She couldn't bring herself to answer, not yet. The weight of his confession pressed against her chest, both terrifying and beautiful. She turned her gaze down, unable to meet his eyes, while the evening wind carried his words around them, lingering like the last warmth of the sun. Morning light spilled gently through the thin curtains of the apartment, carrying with it the song of sparrows perched along the sill. The air was fresh with the faint scent of toast and coffee, a simple fragrance that felt warmer than any luxury perfume. Emma moved quietly about the small kitchen, sliding eggs onto mismatched plates, while Grace, still delicate but stronger each day, sat at the table, wrapped in her favorite cardigan. Alexander had arrived early, bringing a bag of groceries tucked under his arm. He had insisted on brewing the coffee himself, though the old machine sputtered and hissed like it might give out at any second. When the cups were finally filled, he set them on the table with a half smile, clearly pleased by the accomplishment of something so ordinary. They ate together, toast with butter, scrambled eggs, and slices of fruit. It was not much, but in the laughter that sparked when Grace teased Alexander for nearly burning the toast, the room felt rich, as though abundance was measured not by wealth, but by presence. For the first time in years, Grace's eyes shone with the glow of ease, and Emma felt a peace she hadn't realized she was missing. As they lingered, conversation softened into a gentle quiet. Alexander looked across the table, his gaze steady. His voice, when it came, carried none of his usual careful reserve. "Emma," he said, "I don't want to just be the man who paid a bill. I don't want to be remembered only as someone who stepped in when you needed help." He paused, letting the words settle. "I want to be more. I want to be part of this family, yours and your mother's, if you'll let me." Emma's fork stilled, her heart racing. Grace smiled faintly, eyes glistening as if she had been waiting for this moment. Emma looked down, struggling against the wave of emotion rising in her chest. Pride, fear, gratitude, and something warmer all collided inside her, making speech impossible. Instead, her hand moved almost without thought. She reached across the table, laying her slender fingers gently over his. The touch was light, hesitant, but real. She didn't speak, yet the gesture spoke volumes. Alexander's eyes softened, and a small smile touched his lips. Grace let out a quiet sigh, as though the morning had finally given her the answer she hoped to see. In that simple kitchen, over toast and coffee, something new had begun. Not a grand declaration, but the fragile, undeniable start of belonging. The park glowed in the soft embrace of sunset. The sky brushed with strokes of gold and rose. Light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that danced across the path where Emma, Grace, and Alexander walked together. The air was cool, carrying the gentle rustle of leaves, while somewhere nearby, children's laughter blended with the quiet hum of evening. Grace moved slowly, but her steps were steady, each one more confident than the last. She held a small shawl around her shoulders, her face lit with the contentment of simply being outside, alive, part of this moment. Emma walked beside her, one hand linked with Alexander's, the warmth of his palm anchoring her. For weeks she had wrestled with pride and fear, but tonight, as the fading light wrapped them in its glow, she allowed herself to let go. Their laughter rose now and then, over Grace's gentle teasing, over Alexander's attempts to describe his clumsy first attempts at cooking, over memories Emma dared to share from her childhood. Each sound echoed like a promise that the loneliness they had all once known no longer held them captive. As they reached a small clearing, the three of them paused, the sky opened wide, spilling its last brilliance across the grass. Emma turned to Alexander, her eyes shimmering. She leaned closer, her voice soft but certain. "That night, my mother was saved, And tonight, I realize I was saved too. Alexander's gaze held hers, unspoken words carried in the way his fingers tightened gently around her hand. Grace watched them, her smile tender, her eyes moist, as though she had been waiting her whole life to see her daughter held so carefully. The world around them quieted, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the steady rhythm of 3 sets of footsteps. Together, they moved forward, not as strangers bound by chance, but as a family born of kindness and love. The sun slipped lower, painting their silhouettes in a golden glow. To anyone watching, they would have seemed inseparable, a daughter, a mother, and a man who had chosen them not out of duty, but out of love. In the hush of that evening, it was clear they had found home in one another, forever. In the end, Emma's story is not just about love, it is about the quiet power of kindness. A single act, offered without expectation, can alter the course of someone's life forever. Alexander gave more than money. He gave presence, dignity, and hope. Grace, with her wisdom, reminded us that love is never weakness. It is the strength that carries us through the storms. And Emma discovered that accepting help is not about losing pride, but about allowing our hearts to grow. Perhaps the real lesson is this. In our darkest hours, it isn't wealth or status that saves us, but the compassion of another soul willing to walk beside us. A kind hand extended at the right moment can be the beginning of a new life. What about you? Have you ever been touched by an act of kindness that changed the way you see the world? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if this story stirred something in your heart, press 1 in the comments so we know it reached you. Finally, if you enjoy stories that remind us of hope, family, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting to inspire you, and sometimes all it takes is one to light the way.